Okay, so in this video we're going to introduce if structure and if else structure, and this is going to now relate to code that you're going to be writing yourself eventually. And so as we look at this, remember that this is we're going to be coding the computer to make decisions. And so let's say that we have a program that is going to have the user enter a test score, and then the program will tell the user whether they passed or not. And so in this first case, they're actually only going to give one alternative. They're only going to say if they passed. And so here we have the scanner object, and then we have the passing score, let's just say, is 70. Alright, so we've got a named constant here. And then we have the prompt for the user, enter the test score. And then we're going to have declare in the variable or the memory location that's going to store the user input. And so now we're going to take that value and we're going to use it in actually both variables in a Boolean expression. And so we're going to say is the test score, let's say that they said 75. This is a variable call, and so is 75 greater than, and passing score has a value of 70. And so these are variable calls. You're calling the memory locations. And let's say the test score that is entered by the user was 75. Well, now the computer has a decision to make. Either it's going to say, congratulations, you passed, or it's going to ignore that and just print this final statement. And so we go in here and it says true. This is a true statement, so it's going to say congratulations, you passed. And then it's going to go on to the next line and say thank you, your score has been entered. Alright, so this is an example of if structure and how it's used. And so let's take a look at let's see how we want to do this. We're going to label those terms in just a second. So we're going to go into here and go grade report. So let's see how that works. And so here we are in this program. It's what we have in the paper. And so it's either going to say congratulations, you passed, and thank you, your score has been entered, or it's just going to say thank you, your score has been entered. So here we run it. Enter the test score, go 75, congratulations, you passed, which makes sense. Thank you, your score has been entered. Now what we do, and we'll talk about this later, but we want to test the different possibilities. Now they might have a score greater than 70, but they might have the score 70. So testing 70 is also a good one because some students write their Boolean expressions incorrectly. And this is a good time to catch it when you take one of the borders, one of the parameters. So the passing score of 70, and so we check that out, and we see that it says 70, you passed, thank you, your score has been entered. So that's working. And then we test it with a score less than 70. So let's take 65. And it says, thank you, your score has been entered. So notice that's what's happened is that that this part was actually ignored when this was false. Right? If it's true, it does this inside. If it's false, it ignores it. And so let's take a look at our notes. The if clause, no, we got to label these terms. That's what we got to do. If structure. Alright, so these are terminology. This is terminology again for the purpose of communication. So the other thing I want to warn you is that some of the terms I use are not going to be what the book uses. And so I'm trying to use what the book uses as much as I can, but sometimes I don't relate to what the book calls it as well. So the book does not use the term if structure, but I like using it because it clarifies what we're dealing with. So if structure starts with the if statement and goes to the ending curly brace. So I probably should have said what is the if statement first. So this right here is the if statement. So make sure you're labeling this. Okay, don't just underline things like I'm doing. You got to make sure that you label this on your notes. So this is called the if statement. And the if statement contains the Boolean expression or the condition. Now the book is going to call it the condition more than the Boolean expression, at least what I've read so far. So I'm going to use Boolean expression a lot, and the book will use condition. So the condition, this is right here the Boolean expression inside the parentheses. It's the Boolean expression, or it's the condition. It is what's being tested. It's what's being evaluated to be true or false. And this is important because if it's true, then the statement inside the curly braces is executed. If it's false, they're ignored. And so the curly braces, which I didn't include these, but you should know what these are. All right, we did an opening and closing for the class. We did an opening and closing curly braces for the main method. Now you have opening and closing braces, or beginning and ending curly braces for the if clause. And so we're going to call this part in here, this is the if clause. Now the book calls it basically a branch. In fact, it calls this whole thing an if statement. And so I don't know. I don't really care for it as much. And so, but anyways, this is a branch because we're going to see there's going to be more than one branch. Also, I've seen other documentation where they call it block, like an if block. So if clause, if block, it's a branch of the if statement. This right here, the if statement begins the if structure and it ends with the final closing curly brace. Every time the compiler sees an if structure or an if statement, it will execute that line and it will evaluate the Boolean expression or the condition to be true or false. Alright, so let's go on and see what we have next. The if clause is executed only if the Boolean expression or the condition is true. We already explained that. Alright, so if this is true, then the if clause is executed. Now this line right here does not depend on the Boolean expression. It could care less whether this is true or false because it's not part of the if structure. Anything outside of the if structure is going to be executed. Alright, then we go in here to number 8. If the Boolean expression is false, the if clause is ignored by the compiler. Ignored by the compiler. And so that's what you want to make sure you write in there. Alright, so let's move on. If-else structure. An if-else structure is an if statement with two branches. That's what the book calls it. Two branches. In fact, it calls the whole thing, this whole thing, oh, you're serious. This doesn't usually do this. This whole thing is called an if statement, according to the book. And you have two branches, branch here and a branch here. Alright? I don't care for that as much. We're going to give it some different names. So let's take a look at this first, an if-else structure. So here's what happens with an if-else structure. When you have this going on, this is where you have more than one alternative. So either based on whether this is true or false, right here, it's either going to, the compiler is either going to execute the if clause or the else clause. But that depends on this being true or false. And so if we look at this and we say that, let's say that we get a 75, then 75 is true. It's a passing score of 70. Then this is true. So then it prints, congratulations, you passed. And then the else block or the else clause, the else branch, is ignored. And then it will say, thank you, your score has been entered. So here we go. Test score 75, and notice then it says, congratulations, you passed, thank you, your score has been entered. It doesn't say, it ignores the sorry and ignores the you will need to retake the test. Alright, let's try another one then. If, let's say that the score is actually a 60. Well, 60 is not greater than or equal to 70. So this is false. And so it ignores, the compiler ignores the if branch or the if block or the if clause and executes the else clause or the else block, else branch. And then of course it goes on to this statement because this isn't part of the if-else structure. And so let's run it and make sure that's really what's going on here. Enter the score, 60. So it says, sorry, your score is not passing. Just like we said here, you will need to retake the test. And thank you, your score has been entered. Alright, so let's go ahead and label, I think, is that what we have next here going on? Label these terms. The if-else structure. Alright, the if-else structure starts with the if. Well, let's skip that yet. Let's go. Here's the if statement, which you've already talked about. And then this is the else statement right here. This, we're going to call this an else statement. So my question to you is, what's the difference between an if statement and an else statement other than the fact that one has if and one has else? Hopefully you see that this has a Boolean expression, if has a Boolean expression, else does not. Why is that? Because if this is true, it's going to skip this. But if it's false, anything else is going to do this. It doesn't have to say, well, what if, passing score is less than or equal to the testing score. No, it doesn't have to do that, because the only other possibilities, else handles all the remaining possibilities. And so there's no need to stipulate some Boolean expression that has to be evaluated. This is false, we're doing it. And so this is the else statement, and this, of course, is the else clause. This is the else block or the else branch. You could say the else, yeah, so we'll just say it like that. And then, let's get rid of this off here. So the if-else structure starts with the if statement, goes to the last curly brace of the if-else structure. And then this is the else clause right here. Okay, then it says label each alternative. Well, this is the first alternative. So make sure you label this so that you know what we mean by alternative. Okay, these are the various options that the computer or the compiler has. So either it's going to do this stuff, this is the first alternative, so alternative 1. The second alternative is for it to print, sorry, you didn't pass the test. So you have two alternatives. Now later we're going to see how to code this for more than two alternatives. There's going to enter something else. Alright, so let's see. Let's go on here. Now, here's the important notes of interest that you gotta know. An if-else structure may contain one or more alternatives. Okay, it can contain one or more alternatives. Let's see. And actually, let's change that to say two or more. Let's say two or more, because if you have an else in there, you have to have an if. Okay, there's no question. Always start with an if. So that's one alternative. But if you have another alternative, then you're going to have an else. You could have another one that we'll talk about later. But an if-else structure means that you have two or more alternatives. B. No matter how many alternatives exist, only one alternative is always executed. Okay, so only one alternative is always executed. It doesn't ever execute two or three or four alternatives, only one. The rest are ignored. Alright, the rest are ignored. We've demonstrated that with crossing things out. And for some of you, when you start tracing code on paper and things, that might be a good idea to cross out things that are ignored. Well, which alternative is going to be run, okay, or executed? And it's the first alternative, where the Boolean expression is true. It's the first alternative. Once it finds that alternative that's true, the Boolean expression is true, it's going to execute that clause and ignore anything else that's left in the if-else structure. The else clause is executed only if no Boolean expressions are true. Or you could say if all Boolean expressions are false. Because else is always at the end. And so if all the, let's say you have 5 alternatives, that means you're going to have 4 Boolean expressions. If all 4 of those Boolean expressions are false, then the else clause will be executed. Clauses may contain one or more statements. One or more statements. So it's not just one statement. So just because our example only has 1 or only has 2, you could have 3 or 4 or 5. You could have a whole bunch of statements in there. Curly braces are optional. Okay, we could actually, well, I'll say this later. Curly braces are optional if a clause contains, and this probably should have an S here, if a clause contains only one statement. So up here, here's a clause that has has only one statement. Well, we could eliminate these braces right here, and the compiler will handle it just fine. Now, in this clause, we have two statements, so we have to have these curly braces. If we were to take these out, the compiler would say, "Oh, well, this only then." The only part of the if clause or the else clause would be right here, just this line. It wouldn't even consider this line here to be part of the else clause. So therefore, if this were false, it would skip this. It would execute, "Sorry, your score is not passing," and then it would print, "You will need to retake the test." And here's the other problem. If you don't have your braces in here. See, the compiler's not going to get mad at you. It's just that it's only going to look at this as being part of the else clause. If this is true, it's going to print, "Congratulations, you passed." It's going to skip the else block, which is only going to be considered to be this because you don't have any curly braces. And then it's going to print this one and say, "You will need to retake the test." That doesn't make sense. So you passed, but now you have to retake the test. It doesn't mean doesn't work like that. So that's why you've got to have your curly braces if you have two or more. But here's the kicker. The kicker is this. However, it says we will always use curly braces. Okay, we're always going to use curly braces. It's just a lot easier. You'll find that it's just a lot easier to read your code if you include your curly braces. And then the next thing is to pay attention to indentation. Pay attention to indentation. So you see how things are being indented in here. You got to make sure you follow that when you're writing your code. And then test every type of possibility. Test every type of possibility. Remember, you always test your code. You never just write it and say, "Oh, I'm done." You're not done until you test it. And so when we test this, we already modeled this. And so make sure you write in here. In this case, we would model greater than, or we would test an amount greater than 70. We would test the amount 70. And I want to say this before I finish up. You always want to test your boundaries. So is something greater than or equal to 70? Test that 70, because that'll be important, because that'll make sure that you do this part correctly. Because sometimes you need the greater than, sometimes you need the greater than and the equal to. So that's very important. And then the final, well, let's see, the final case, we said greater than 70, 70, and then less than 70. That would be testing every type of possibility. All right, that's it on our intro to if and if else structure.